The girl followed the millionaire's son every day without him noticing. When she finally revealed the reason, he couldn't hold back his tears. The sun was barely up when Amina began her morning. She tugged her worn sandals over her feet, pushing open the rickety wooden door of their small house. The yard outside was dry, cracked with dust. The air had that particular morning stillness, broken only by the distant sound of cars passing by on the main road. She glanced back to see her younger siblings still asleep, their tiny bodies tangled together on the mattress. Her mother was already gone, probably on her way to clean someone else's house. Amina sighed, grabbing the empty jerry can from the corner of the room. She had to get water before the lines got too long. She moved quickly, the jerry can bumping against her thigh as she walked, her steps familiar with the path. It wasn't easy, but it was life. She carried the water back, feeling the weight on her shoulder, a dull ache that had become part of her body. When she returned, her brothers were awake, rubbing their eyes and looking at her. She smiled at them, pushing aside the tiredness. "Get up. School soon," she said, placing the water down. Later that day, after she got her siblings ready, she left them with a neighbor and headed to school. The streets were a mix of laughter, shouting, and the occasional honking car. It was just another day. But then, as she rounded the corner near the school, she noticed the shiny black car that parked by the front gate. It was the kind that always caught everyone's attention. A boy got out of the car. His blonde hair shone in the sun, and he didn't seem to notice the crowd around him. He looked at his phone, his bodyguard standing close behind. Amina stopped and watched. The boy had the kind of life that seemed impossible. She saw him walk, with a lazy confidence, his eyes half-lidded as if nothing could touch him. The driver closed the car door, and they moved inside the school. That was Ethan. She had heard his name before. Her classmates spoke about him sometimes, about the mansion he lived in, about the vacations his family took. Amina watched him disappear into the building. Her fingers tightened around the straps of her school bag. It felt unfair, like he was living on a different planet. He had everything, while she carried water and worried about food. Amina was late getting home that day. Her teacher kept her behind, talking about her grades. She listened with her head down, nodding when she was supposed to. She left school with her thoughts clouded, her feet dragging along the dusty road. When she got home, the landlord was already there, waiting. He was a heavy-set man, his arms crossed and his face pulled into a frown. "Where's your mother?" he demanded as soon as she approached. "She's working," Amina answered, setting her school bag down, her voice quiet. She didn't look up. "Rent's overdue," he said, and Amina felt her stomach drop. She didn't need to hear it again. She knew. "Tell her she has until the end of the week, or you're out. No more waiting." Amina swallowed, her throat dry. She nodded, her fingers tightening into a fist. The landlord huffed, turned, and walked away, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding in her ears. That night, Amina's mother came home late, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She looked at Amina, saw the way her shoulders slumped, and knew. They didn't need words. Her mother simply sat down at the table, resting her head in her hands. The room was too quiet. The only sound was the breathing of her sleeping brothers. "We'll figure something out," her mother said, but her voice was hollow. Amina nodded, but deep inside, a tightness was growing. There had to be something she could do. She couldn't just wait for things to fall apart. The next morning, she noticed Ethan again. He got out of the car, same as before, with that calm, unconcerned look. Amina watched from across the street. Her eyes followed him as he moved, taking in the clean lines of his uniform, the way his shoes shined, and how his driver stood ready to open the door for him. A plan started to form in her head. She knew it was reckless, but her family was running out of time. If there was a chance to make things different, she had to try. Amina spent the next couple of days following Ethan from a distance. She was careful, staying behind buildings or mixing into crowds, watching as he went from school to his car, then home. She memorized the way the streets turned, the walls around his house, the big iron gate at the entrance. It was another world, one that made her feel small and out of place. But then, on the third day, something caught her attention. She overheard one of the staff, an older gardener, talking about Ethan's father, something about the past, something about an accident. Amina's ears perked up. It sounded familiar, like it scratched at a memory she had tried to forget. Her father's death. The gardener's words echoed in her mind, refusing to leave her alone. That night, Amina lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of her father. She remembered his hands, rough but gentle, and the way he used to come home, tired but smiling. She remembered how he worked as a gardener at some rich house before he died. They had called it an accident. But what if it wasn't? What if there was more to it? She sat up, her heart pounding. She had to know. She had to get close to Ethan. Maybe he held the answers. Maybe his family did. By the time she fell asleep, Amina had made up her mind. She didn't know exactly how she would do it, but she was going to get into that house. She would find a way to talk to Ethan. She would make him listen, no matter what. Amina watched Ethan closely that day, her eyes tracking his every move as he stepped out of the car at school. His bodyguard, a tall man in a dark suit, followed a few steps behind. Ethan didn't notice her, but then again, he never noticed anyone like her. He was too wrapped up in his own world. The bell rang, signaling the start of classes, but Amina wasn't going in. She had other plans. She kept her distance, following as Ethan walked to the building. She had made up her mind. Today was the day she'd try to talk to him, try to get him alone. She knew it was risky, but her family's situation was desperate. She needed to find answers about her father's death, and for that, she needed Ethan. After school, Amina waited outside, her heart thumping heavily in her chest. She felt the weight of the moment press down on her. She was scared. Of course she was. But she couldn't turn back now. She saw Ethan leave the building, the bodyguard just behind him, and her body tensed. She trailed them, keeping far enough back so they wouldn't notice her. When they reached the parking lot, Ethan paused to check his phone while his bodyguard opened the car door. This was her chance. She stepped forward, her heart in her throat. "Hey," she called out, her voice catching in the breeze. Ethan didn't react at first. She had to call again, louder this time. "Hey, you, Ethan." He turned, his eyebrows pulling together in confusion. The bodyguard immediately stepped between them, his gaze sharp, his stance ready. Amina took a step back, her hands up to show she meant no harm. "What are you doing here?" the bodyguard barked. I need to talk to Ethan," she stammered, her voice small but steady. "Just for a moment." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, his expression shifting from annoyance to curiosity. But before he could speak, the bodyguard moved forward, grabbing Amina's arm roughly. "Get lost, kid," he said, dragging her away from the car. The grip on her arm was painful and she winced. "Wait," she started, trying to resist. But the bodyguard was much stronger. He pushed her away, hard enough that she stumbled and almost fell. Amina's face burned with embarrassment. She could feel the stares of others around her, the whispers. She straightened herself, glaring at the bodyguard, her hands balling into fists. Ethan watched, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to say something. But he didn't. He simply turned back to his car, sliding in without another word. The door closed, and the car drove off, leaving Amina standing there, her body shaking from the mix of humiliation and anger. She walked home slowly, her head down, her eyes stinging. The whole world felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her shoulders. She didn't know how to explain it, the feeling of being so close to something, only to have it ripped away so easily. The unfairness of it all made her want to scream. When she got home, her mother was already there, cooking something on their small stove. The smell of boiling rice filled the room, but Amina barely noticed it. Her mother looked up and frowned when she saw Amina's face. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Nothing," Amina mumbled, dropping her school bag on the floor. Her mother wasn't having it. She moved closer, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the red marks on Amina's arm. "Who did this?" she demanded, grabbing Amina's arm to get a better look. "No one. It doesn't matter," Amina said, trying to pull her arm away. Her mother's face twisted in anger. "Are you sneaking around again? I told you to stay away from those people. They're nothing but trouble. They think we're nothing, Amina. You can't get mixed up with them. Do you want more problems for us?" Amina bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She hated this. She hated feeling helpless, hated that her mother was right. She didn't know what she was doing, didn't know if this plan would even work. But what choice did she have? She couldn't just do nothing. The next day, Amina found herself back at the school, her eyes once again searching for Ethan. She didn't care about the risk anymore. She had already been pushed around, humiliated. What was one more time if it meant she could get the answers she needed? She stayed back this time, watching as Ethan left the building, his bodyguard close by as usual. The car pulled up, and Amina clenched her fists, holding herself back from rushing over. Instead, she followed from a distance as the car drove out of the school gates. She knew the route now, knew where Ethan's house was. Ethan's home was surrounded by tall iron gates, the kind that kept people like Amina out. She stood across the street, watching as the car pulled into the driveway. The gates closed behind it, sealing off that world of privilege and wealth. Amina's eyes narrowed, her body tensed as she watched. She waited there for hours, standing in the shade of a nearby tree, watching the house. She could see the gardeners moving about, tending to the perfectly manicured lawn, the maids coming in and out of the side entrance. It was like watching a different universe, a place where problems like rent and eviction didn't exist. One of the gardeners caught her eye, a thin older man, his back bent from years of hard work. He looked familiar. She watched him, listened as he spoke to another worker, their voices carrying across the lawn. She couldn't make out everything, but one word stuck out. Accident. Her father. Amina's heart skipped a beat. She stepped forward trying to hear more, but the gardener moved away, his voice fading into the distance. She clenched her jaw, frustration bubbling inside her. There was something here, something that connected her father to this place. She was sure of it now. That night, as she walked back home, Amina's thoughts raced. She thought of her father, of the way he used to smile at her, the way he worked so hard, even when he was tired. She remembered the day they told her he was gone, how it felt like the world had been ripped away from under her feet. They had said it was an accident, but something didn't add up. She knew there was more to it, and now she had heard enough to believe it wasn't just in her head. She had to find a way to get closer to Ethan, to make him talk to her. She wasn't going to give up, not now. The next morning, Amina felt different. There was no more hesitation in her mind, no more doubt. She knew what she had to do. She was going to find Ethan again, and she was going to make him listen to her, no matter what it took. She watched from the same spot near the school gate, waiting for the black car to arrive. And when it did, she stepped out of the shadows, her eyes set on Ethan. This time she wasn't going to be pushed away. Amina woke up before the sun, the first glimmers of dawn barely touching the sky. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she buttoned her faded school blouse. Her mother was still asleep, her head resting heavily on the old pillow. Amina slipped out silently, careful not to wake her brothers, and grabbed her school bag. Today she knew she wouldn't be going to class. She reached the school just as the morning bell rang, slipping into her usual spot across the street where she could watch Ethan's car arrive. The black luxury vehicle pulled up, its glossy exterior reflecting the sun. Ethan stepped out, his bodyguard shadowing him. Amina's eyes followed them, and her heart pounded. She knew the route, the routines. Today she wouldn't just watch. Today she had to take action. The school day ended, and Amina was ready. She stayed far enough away to avoid being spotted, but close enough that she could keep track of Ethan. He moved through the crowded yard, indifferent to the rush of students around him. Amina trailed behind, her eyes fixed on him, her steps careful and deliberate. Ethan walked through the gate to his waiting car, the bodyguard right behind him. Amina's stomach clenched with nerves, her mouth dry as dust. She wasn't sure what her plan was. Maybe she'd talk to him if she got the chance. Maybe she'd just watch and wait. The gate closed behind them, and the car pulled out. Without thinking, Amina began to run. She darted into the street, keeping to the side so she wouldn't lose sight of the vehicle. The afternoon sun was harsh, and sweat prickled her skin. But she didn't stop. She needed to know where Ethan went after school. She needed to understand his life, to figure out how to get closer to him. They reached the mansion soon enough, and Amina skidded to a stop, hiding behind the wide trunk of a tree across the street. She watched the car glide smoothly through the massive iron gates. They swung shut, locking out the rest of the world. Amina stood there, her breath heavy, feeling a mixture of frustration and determination. The mansion was enormous. She could see the front yard with its well-kept lawn, the flower beds that looked too perfect to be real. She saw the staff bustling around, moving like they were on invisible strings. Then she spotted Ethan, walking from the car to the front entrance, his bodyguard still by his side. Amina swallowed hard. She had no idea how she was going to do it, but she knew she had to get inside. She stepped back, keeping herself hidden as she watched. Her eyes scanned the perimeter, taking in the high walls, the security cameras, the uniformed guards. It wouldn't be easy, but she didn't care. Her father's face flashed in her mind. His smile, the way he'd look at her with pride. She clenched her fists. She was doing this for him. Later that afternoon, Amina stayed hidden behind the bushes near the gate, waiting. She watched as the gardeners worked, tending to the flowers. She recognized one of them, a thin, older man with graying hair. He moved slowly, his back bent, but there was something familiar about him. The older gardener spoke to one of the younger men, his voice low. Amina strained to hear. "The accident," he said. The words floated to her like pieces of a broken puzzle. No one ever questioned it, just covered it up like everything else. Amina's heart pounded in her ears. Her father's accident. The words twisted inside her, made her feel both angry and scared. She needed to know more, but she couldn't just walk up and ask. She had to get closer to Ethan, to get him to help her. The sun began to set, and Amina knew she couldn't stay there forever. She turned and made her way back home, her feet dragging through the dusty streets. The voices from earlier echoed in her mind, the vague hints and the unfinished thoughts. She thought of her father, remembered the way he used to carry her on his shoulders, the way he laughed. It wasn't fair. He deserved better than this. Her family deserved better. By the time she reached home, her mother was already there, cooking dinner over their small stove. She looked up, her face tired but still soft. "Where were you?" her mother asked, her voice edged with worry. Amina hesitated. She didn't want to lie, but she also couldn't tell her mother the truth. "I was just at school," she said, her eyes dropping to the floor. Her mother didn't say anything for a moment. Then she sighed, shaking her head. "You need to stay away from those rich people," she said quietly. "They're not like us, Amina. They don't care about us. Don't get mixed up in their world." Amina swallowed, her throat tight. "I know," she said, even though she didn't mean it. She couldn't stay away. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding out the truth. The next morning, Amina woke up with a new resolve. She dressed quickly, her hands steady. Today she would get inside. She would find a way. She didn't know how, but she'd figure it out. She left home before anyone else was awake, her mother's warning still echoing in her ears, but she pushed it aside. She reached Ethan's school just in time to see the black car pull up. Amina moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, her eyes fixed on Ethan as he stepped out. She followed him from a distance, her heart pounding. She knew it was dangerous, but she didn't care. She needed answers, and Ethan was her way in. After school, she trailed Ethan to the mansion again. This time she was determined not to just stand and watch. She needed to make a move. She waited until the car had disappeared behind the gates. Then she crept closer, keeping to the side where the bushes grew thick. Her breath came in short bursts, her hands trembling slightly. She saw the older gardener again, his back to her as he worked on a flower bed near the side entrance. Amina took a deep breath and stepped forward, moving quickly. She crouched behind the bushes, close enough to hear the faint murmur of voices coming from the staff entrance. One of the maids stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. She glanced at the gardener, her face drawn with concern. "They should have said something back then," she muttered. "He wasn't supposed to be working alone that day." The gardener sighed. "They just wanted it buried, you know how it is. It wasn't right, but what could we do?" Amina's heart hammered in her chest. They were talking about her father, she was sure of it. She clenched her fists, anger boiling inside her. They knew something. They all knew. But no one did anything. She had to talk to Ethan. She had to make him see. She stepped back, her foot snapping a twig. The sound was loud in the quiet evening air. The gardener turned, his eyes narrowing. "Hey!" he shouted, straightening up. Amina didn't wait. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the ground, her breath coming in gasps. She didn't stop until she was far enough away, her body trembling, her chest aching. She had almost been caught, but it didn't matter. She had heard enough. That night, as Amina lay in bed, she stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought of her father, of the accident, of the words she had overheard. She thought of Ethan, of the way he walked through life like nothing could touch him. She needed to talk to him, to make him understand. She needed him to help her get the answers her family deserved. Tomorrow, she would try again. She wasn't giving up. Amina woke up determined, her eyes still heavy from the lack of sleep. She glanced at her younger siblings, tangled together on the mattress, their small faces peaceful and unaware of the turmoil inside her. She pulled on her clothes quietly, taking her time to lace her worn-out shoes. Today, she was going to try again. Today, she would make Ethan listen. By the time she reached the school gates, the morning chaos was in full swing. Children ran around, shouting to one another, the air buzzing with excitement. Amina stood at her usual spot, her gaze sharp as she searched for the familiar black car. When it pulled up, her heartbeat quickened. She watched as Ethan got out, the bodyguard trailing behind, his face set in its usual stern expression. Amina followed them from a distance, her steps slow, careful not to attract attention. She didn't know how she would do it, but she had to make her way into his world. She had to make him understand. After school, Amina waited near the edge of the gate, her body pressed against the cool metal of the fence. She knew the guards were watching, and she had to be smart about it. The black car pulled up like clockwork, and she spotted Ethan walking towards it. She held her breath as she stepped out from her hiding spot, her eyes locked on his figure. "Ethan!" she called, her voice breaking through the chatter of the students around her. He stopped and turned, his eyes searching until they landed on her. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Amina took a step forward, her heart thudding in her chest. She saw confusion flicker in his expression, but before he could react, the bodyguard moved between them, his face hardening. "What are you doing here again?" The guard's voice was sharp, and he grabbed her arm roughly. Amina winced but stood her ground. "I need to talk to him," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "Just let me talk to him." The guard began to pull her away, his grip like iron, but Ethan's voice stopped him. "Wait," Ethan said, his gaze still on Amina. He took a step forward, curiosity evident on his face. "Who are you?" Amina swallowed, her mouth dry. She could feel the weight of the moment, the tension pulling at her. "My name is Amina," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Ethan looked at her, then at the bodyguard, who was frowning. "Just let her go," Ethan said, his voice dismissive, and the guard reluctantly released her arm. Amina took a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "Please," she said, her voice low but desperate. "Just hear me out. I need your help." Ethan tilted his head, studying her. He didn't look angry, just confused. "Why me?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "What could I possibly do for you?" Before Amina could answer, a maid approached, motioning towards the car, and the brief moment they had vanished. Ethan glanced at her one last time, his eyes narrowing slightly. He turned, moving towards the car, and Amina stood there, frozen in place. The car pulled away, and Amina was left alone, a mix of hope and frustration battling inside her. She had gotten his attention, if only for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was something. She just had to find another way. Later that day, Amina hid near the mansion, crouched behind a row of neatly trimmed bushes. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in reds and oranges. She could hear the distant voices of the staff, the hum of conversation drifting through the still evening air. She could see Ethan through the window, moving around inside the house, his life separated from hers by thick walls and closed doors. She was about to move closer when she heard footsteps approaching. She ducked down, her heart pounding in her ears. It was one of the maids, her voice quiet as she spoke into her phone. "I know it wasn't right. They should have said something," she muttered, her tone sharp, frustration evident. Amina strained to hear, her breath held in her throat. She caught pieces of the conversation, something about an accident, about things being hidden. Her fingers dug into the dirt, her jaw clenched. She had been right. There was more to her father's death, and these people knew something. The maid moved away, her voice fading, and Amina was left alone again. She felt anger bubbling inside her, a burning feeling that made her hands shake. She had to find a way to talk to Ethan, to tell him what she knew. He was the only one who could help her. She didn't care about the risks anymore. She had lost too much already, and she wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, Amina stood by the school gate, her eyes searching for Ethan. When the black car arrived, her breath caught. She watched as Ethan stepped out, his expression tired, like he had barely slept. She took a step forward, her fingers tightening around the straps of her school bag. "Ethan!" she called, louder this time, her voice cutting through the noise. He looked up, his eyes locking on hers. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. Amina walked towards him, her heart pounding. The bodyguard stepped forward, but Ethan held up his hand, stopping him. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice curious but guarded. Amina swallowed hard. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "It's about my father. He used to work for your family." Ethan blinked, clearly taken aback. "My family?" he repeated, confusion in his voice. "Yes," Amina said, stepping closer. She could feel the eyes of the other students on her, but she didn't care. "He was a gardener. He died in an accident, but I think there was more to it." Ethan frowned, his expression shifting. He looked at her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Fine," he said. "Meet me after school outside the gate." Amina's heart soared, and she nodded quickly. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping back, her eyes still on his face. Ethan turned, walking towards the building, and Amina watched until he disappeared inside. She took a deep breath, her body trembling from the rush of emotions. She had done it. She had gotten through to him. Now she just had to wait. The rest of the day passed slowly, every minute feeling like an hour. Amina could barely focus in class, her mind racing with thoughts of what she would say to Ethan, how she would explain everything. She knew she had to be careful, that she couldn't push too hard, but she also knew that this was her only chance. She had to make him understand. When the final bell rang, Amina was the first one out of the classroom. She rushed to the gate, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw Ethan standing there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. She walked towards him, her heart pounding. Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. "All right," he said. "I'm here. What do you want to tell me?" Amina took a deep breath, her fingers trembling. "It's about my father," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "He worked for your family and he died in an accident. But I heard something that made me think it wasn't really an accident." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, surprise flashing across his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low. Amina hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I heard some of the staff talking," she said. "They said something about covering it up. I need to know the truth. I need your help." Ethan stared at her, his expression conflicted. He looked away for a moment, then back at her. "All right," he said slowly. "I don't know if I can help, but I'll try." Amina's breath caught and she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you." Ethan nodded, his expression still unsure. "We'll talk more later," he said, turning away. "I'll see what I can find out." Amina watched as he walked away, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was just the beginning, but it was enough. She had taken the first step, and now there was no turning back. Amina woke up feeling both anxious and hopeful. She had finally made contact with Ethan, finally gotten through to him. He had listened, even if he was unsure. Today, she would continue on the path she had started. There was no going back now. She moved through her morning routine in silence, her mother watching her with suspicious eyes. Amina knew she had been acting differently, and her mother wasn't oblivious. She tightened her lips, avoiding her mother's gaze as she pulled on her worn-out shoes and slung her school bag over her shoulder. Her mother frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Where have you been sneaking off to?" she asked, her voice edged with worry. "You've been gone too long these days, Amina. I don't like it." Amina hesitated, her stomach tightening. She couldn't tell her mother the truth. She didn't want to worry her, didn't want her to try to stop her. "I've just been staying late at school," Amina lied, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her mother sighed heavily, shaking her head. "You need to stop this, Amina. Whatever you're doing, it's dangerous. Rich people like them, they don't care about us. They'll hurt us if we get in their way." Amina clenched her jaw, the frustration bubbling inside her. She wanted to tell her mother that she was wrong, that she was doing this for them, but she couldn't. Instead, she turned away, her eyes burning. "I know," she mumbled, heading for the door. "I'm going to school now." The school day was a blur. Amina could barely pay attention, her mind focused on Ethan and the conversation they would have. She knew it was a long shot, that Ethan might not find anything, but she had to believe. She had to trust that this was the right thing to do. The final bell rang, and Amina rushed out of the classroom, her feet carrying her quickly to the gate. She scanned the crowd, searching for Ethan's blonde head. She spotted him leaning against the gate, his bodyguard nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the students leaving. Ethan looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Hey," he said, his voice flat. "You still want to talk?" Amina nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. "Yes," she said, "please." Ethan glanced at his bodyguard, who gave a reluctant sigh but nodded, stepping back slightly to give them space. Ethan turned his attention back to Amina, his eyes serious. "Look, I don't know if there's anything I can do," he said, his voice low. "I don't even know what happened to your father." Amina took a deep breath, her eyes pleading. "I just need you to ask. Please. Your family must know something. My father, he worked for you, he died, and no one told us why." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing away. "I asked my dad last night," he said after a moment, his voice quiet. "He said it was just an accident, that's all." Amina felt her heart sink, her hopes crumbling. She stared at Ethan, her body tensing. "That can't be it," she said, her voice trembling. "There's more." "I know there is." Ethan looked back at her, his face softening. "Look, I don't know, okay?" he said, his voice apologetic. "I don't know what happened, but I can try to find out more." Amina nodded, swallowing hard. She knew she couldn't push him too much, but the desperation inside her was growing. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, I need to know." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said. "I'll try. But you have to understand, if my dad says it was an accident, then that's probably what it was." Amina's chest tightened, but she nodded, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I understand," she whispered, her eyes burning. "Just, please, ask again. For me." Ethan nodded, his eyes meeting hers. There was something in his gaze that Amina couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe, or regret. He turned away, motioning for his bodyguard to follow. "I'll see you," he said, his voice fading as he walked away. Amina watched him go, her body trembling with a mix of hope and fear. She knew Ethan might not find anything, that he might just give up. But she couldn't give up. Not now. Not when she had come this far. That night, Amina returned home, her heart heavy. She entered the small house quietly, her mother already there, cooking over the stove. The room was filled with the smell of beans boiling, and her brothers were sitting on the floor, playing with the few toys they had. Her mother looked up as Amina entered, her eyes narrowing. "You're late again," she said, her voice cold. "Where were you this time?" Amina swallowed, her stomach tightening. "Just on school," she lied again, avoiding her mother's gaze. Her mother sighed, shaking her head. "You're going to get yourself into trouble, Amina. I can see it. You're sneaking around, getting mixed up in things you shouldn't. You need to stop." Amina clenched her fists, the frustration boiling inside her. "I'm doing it for us," she said, her voice rising. "I'm trying to help." Her mother's face twisted in anger, and she stepped forward, her eyes fierce. "Help? How is sneaking around those rich people's houses going to help us? They don't care about us, Amina. They never will." Amina felt her chest tighten, the anger and fear mixing together until she couldn't hold it back anymore. "They killed him," she shouted, her voice cracking. "They killed Dad, and I need to know why." The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. Her mother stared at her, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Amina's breath came in ragged bursts, her body trembling. She felt the tears welling up, but she refused to let them fall. Her mother shook her head slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "Amina, you don't know that. You can't know that." Amina looked away, her throat tight. "I heard them talking," she said, her voice low. "The staff at their house. They said something about covering it up. I need to know what happened." Her mother took a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. She stepped forward, pulling Amina into her arms, holding her tightly. "Please, Amina," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't want to lose you too." Amina closed her eyes, her body shaking as she clung to her mother. She knew her mother was scared, knew she was trying to protect her, but Amina couldn't stop. She had to know the truth. The next morning, Amina woke up early, her eyes swollen from the tears she had cried. She dressed slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion. She knew her mother was right. This was dangerous. But she couldn't let it go. She left the house before anyone else was awake, her heart pounding as she made her way to Ethan's house. She didn't know if he would help her, but she had to try. She stood outside the gate, her eyes scanning the property. The mansion loomed in front of her, its walls high and imposing. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she stepped forward. She needed to get inside, needed to find Ethan. She knew it was risky, knew she might get caught. But she had to do it. For her father, for her family. She approached the gate, her heart pounding, her eyes fixed on the mansion. She could see the staff moving around, the gardeners tending to the flower beds, the maids carrying supplies. She needed to be careful, needed to find a way in without being seen. Amina spotted a side entrance, a small gate that was slightly ajar. She glanced around, making sure no one was watching, then slipped through, her breath held tight in her chest. She moved quickly, keeping low, her eyes scanning for any sign of Ethan. She could hear voices, the faint murmur of conversation drifting from the back of the house. She moved closer, her feet quiet on the grass. She peeked around the corner, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Ethan standing near the garden, talking to one of the maids. Amina took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she stepped out from her hiding spot. "Ethan," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her. He glanced at the maid, then back at Amina, his face pale. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice urgent. Amina stepped closer, her eyes pleading. "I need to know the truth," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, Ethan, you have to help me." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. He glanced around, making sure no one else was watching, then nodded. "All right," he said, his voice low. "But we need to be quick. If my dad finds out, we're both in trouble." Amina felt a surge of hope, her heart pounding. She nodded, her eyes locked on his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Ethan gestured for her to follow him, and Amina did, her steps quick and quiet. She knew this was dangerous, knew they could both get caught. But she didn't care. She had to know. She had to find the truth, no matter what it took. Amina followed Ethan through the side garden, keeping her steps light and her eyes scanning for anyone who might see them. They moved quickly, ducking behind hedges and keeping close to the walls of the mansion. Ethan kept looking back at her, his expression tense. "Stay close," he whispered, leading her to a back door that seemed less used. He glanced around before unlocking it, motioning for Amina to step inside. Amina's heart pounded in her ears as she crossed the threshold into Ethan's world. The inside of the mansion was unlike anything she'd ever seen. High ceilings, polished floors, and walls covered with expensive paintings. It was so different from her own home, and for a moment, it felt surreal, like she was in a place that wasn't meant for someone like her. Ethan led her down a narrow hallway, his footsteps almost silent. He stopped outside a door, listening for any noise on the other side before pushing it open and ushering her in. It was a small sitting room, with plush chairs and a large window that looked out over the backyard. Ethan closed the door behind them, turning to face Amina. His face was pale, and his eyes were full of questions. "All right," he said, his voice low. "We're alone. What do you need to know?" Amina swallowed, her throat tight. She stepped closer, her hands trembling slightly. "My father," she began, her voice cracking. "He worked for your family. He died here. They called it an accident, but I know there's more to it. I heard the staff talking about it." Ethan's brow furrowed, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more serious. He moved to one of the chairs and sat down, motioning for Amina to do the same. "What exactly did you hear?" he asked, leaning forward, his eyes fixed on her. Amina hesitated, then took a deep breath. I heard them say something about negligence. They said it was covered up, that it wasn't supposed to happen. They talked about my father like it was someone's fault. Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. He was quiet for a long moment, and Amina could see the conflict on his face. He finally looked back at her, his eyes narrowing. I don't know anything about that, he said, his voice strained. But I can ask my dad. He might know something. Amina clenched her hands in her lap, her heart pounding. Please, she whispered. I just want the truth. I want to know why my father is gone. Ethan nodded, his face softening. All right, he said. I'll talk to him. But you have to understand, if there's something they're hiding, it's not going to be easy to get them to tell me. Amina nodded, her eyes locked on his. I understand, she said. But I need to know, my family needs to know. Suddenly there was a noise from outside the door, a faint shuffle, followed by the sound of someone approaching. Ethan's eyes widened, and he shot up from his seat, motioning for Amina to stay quiet. He quickly crossed the room, peeking out through the crack in the door. He turned back to Amina, his face pale. It's my father, he whispered urgently. You need to hide. Now. Amina's stomach dropped, fear seizing her. Ethan pointed towards a heavy curtain that covered the window. Without thinking, she moved quickly, slipping behind the curtain just as the door opened. Ethan? A deep voice echoed through the room, and Amina felt her heart leap into her throat. She peeked out just enough to see a tall man standing in the doorway, his face stern, his gaze fixed on his son. Ethan forced a smile, stepping forward to meet his father. Hey, Dad, he said, his voice too casual. I was just sitting here, thinking about some school stuff. His father narrowed his eyes, glancing around the room. Amina held her breath, her entire body tense. School stuff, huh? He said, his voice dripping with suspicion. Why are you here, alone, in this part of the house? Ethan shifted on his feet, his eyes darting towards the curtain for a split second before returning to his father. I just needed some quiet, that's all, he said, his voice steady. His father watched him for a moment, his eyes narrowing. You should be studying, Ethan, not wandering around the house like you have nothing better to do. He turned, his gaze scanning the room again. Amina pressed herself against the wall behind the curtain, her breath held tight in her chest. Ethan nodded, forcing another smile. Yeah, I know, I was just about to head back to my room. His father looked at him for another long moment, then sighed, turning to leave. Make sure you do, he said, his voice clipped. And stay out of trouble. Ethan watched as his father walked out, closing the door behind him. He let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. He crossed the room, pulling the curtain aside to reveal Amina, her face pale and her eyes wide. You need to get out of here, Ethan whispered, his voice shaking slightly. If he finds you, we're both in serious trouble. Amina nodded, stepping out from behind the curtain, her body trembling. She could feel the adrenaline still pumping through her veins, the fear lingering like a shadow. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his face softening. Look, I'll talk to him, okay? I'll find out what I can. But you need to go. Now. Amina nodded again, her eyes locking on his. Please, just don't forget, she said, her voice trembling. I need to know. Ethan gave her a small nod, his eyes filled with something Amina couldn't quite place. Maybe pity, maybe regret. I won't forget, he promised, moving to the door. He opened it slightly, checking the hallway before motioning for her to follow. They moved quickly, slipping out of the room and down the hallway. Amina kept her head down, her eyes scanning for any sign of movement. They reached the side door, and Ethan pushed it open, the fresh air hitting Amina like a rush of relief. Go, Ethan whispered, glancing around nervously. I'll find you when I know something. Amina stepped outside, her feet moving quickly across the grass. She didn't look back, her body tense until she was far enough away from the mansion to feel safe. She slipped through the side gate, her heart pounding as she made her way back towards the street. That night, Amina lay in her bed, staring up at the ceiling. The adrenaline from earlier still coursed through her veins, her mind racing with everything that had happened. She thought of Ethan, of the look on his face when he promised to help her. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, that they were up against something much bigger than both of them. But she couldn't stop now. She had come too far. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She had gotten into the mansion, had spoken to Ethan, and he had promised to help her. It was a small step, but it was enough. She had to hold on to that hope, even if it was fragile. The next day, Amina stayed home from school. She told her mother she wasn't feeling well, and her mother didn't press her, just nodded and let her rest. Amina spent the day in bed, her thoughts drifting between hope and fear. She knew Ethan might not find anything, that he might decide it was too risky. But she had to believe in him. She had to believe that he would keep his promise. The sun was setting when she heard a knock at the door. Her mother opened it, her voice muffled as she spoke to someone outside. Amina sat up, her heart skipping a beat when she heard Ethan's voice. "Is Amina here?" he asked, his voice low. Amina rushed to the door, her eyes wide when she saw him standing there. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around as if he was afraid of being seen. "I found something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" Amina nodded, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. She could see the tension on Ethan's face, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "It wasn't an accident," he said, his voice low. "My dad, he knew something went wrong. They just didn't want anyone to find out." Amina felt her heart drop, her body going numb. She had known deep down, but hearing it out loud made it real. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cracking. Ethan looked away, his jaw tight. "They were supposed to have safety measures in place, but they didn't. They cut corners, and your father, he paid the price." Amina felt tears welling up, her body shaking. She clenched her fists, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to escape. "Why?" she whispered, her voice full of pain. "Why didn't they say anything?" Ethan looked back at her, his eyes filled with regret. "They didn't want the blame. They didn't want it to ruin them." Amina closed her eyes, the tears spilling over. She had known there was more to it, but hearing it was like a knife to her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you for telling me." Ethan nodded, his face softening. "I'm sorry, Amina," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I really am." Amina looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and gratitude. She knew it wasn't his fault, that he was trying to help. "It's not your fault," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for helping me." Ethan gave her a small nod, his eyes filled with emotion. "If there's anything else I can do," he began, but Amina shook her head. "You've done enough," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you." Ethan nodded again, his eyes lingering on hers before he turned and walked away, disappearing into the evening shadows. Amina watched him go, her heart heavy, but there was also a sense of relief. She had the truth now. It wasn't going to bring her father back, but it was something. She turned back to the door, wiping her eyes. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she had taken the first step, and that was enough for now. The next day dawned quietly, and Amina woke up with a weight on her chest that she could barely shake off. She had learned the truth, that her father's death was not an accident, but a consequence of someone's negligence, of corners being cut by people who thought their power could erase their mistakes. She spent the morning sitting by the window, staring out at the dusty streets, her mind replaying Ethan's words over and over. She had promised herself she would find out what happened to her father, and now she had. But that wasn't enough. She needed more. She needed some form of justice, some way to make sure her father's death meant something. She needed them to know that his life mattered, that he mattered. She could hear her mother bustling around in the kitchen, her voice soft as she spoke to her younger brothers, telling them to finish their breakfast before heading out. Amina stood up, her heart pounding as she made her way to her mother. She needed to tell her, needed her to understand. "Mama," Amina said, her voice low as she stepped into the kitchen. Her mother looked up, her face softening when she saw the seriousness in Amina's eyes. She set down the pot she was holding, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it, Amina?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. Amina took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I found out what happened to Dad," she said, her voice cracking. "I talked to someone, Ethan. He said it wasn't an accident." Her mother's face paled, her eyes widening. She stepped closer, her hands reaching out to hold Amina's. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice full of fear. Amina swallowed, her throat tight. "It was negligence, Mama. They knew something wasn't right, but they didn't fix it. And Dad, he paid the price for it." Her mother's hands tightened around Amina's, her face crumpling with grief. She closed her eyes, her body trembling. "Why didn't they tell us?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why didn't they say anything?" Amina shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "They didn't want the blame," she said. "They just wanted to cover it up." Her mother let out a choked sob, her hands moving to cover her face. Amina stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her mother, holding her tightly. She could feel her mother's body shaking with the force of her grief, and Amina closed her eyes, her own tears spilling over. For a long moment, they just stood there, holding each other, the weight of the truth pressing down on them. Amina knew this was what they had feared all along, that her father's death had been avoidable, that it was caused by the carelessness of others. But knowing it, hearing it spoken out loud made the pain sharper, more real. Finally, her mother pulled back, wiping her eyes. She looked at Amina, her face filled with a mix of grief and determination. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Amina took a deep breath, her jaw tightening. "We have to make them acknowledge it," she said. "They have to know that we won't just let this go, that Dad mattered." Her mother nodded slowly, her eyes locking on Amina's. "But how, Amina? We don't have their power, their money." Amina's stomach clenched, but she met her mother's gaze steadily. "I have Ethan," she said, her voice firm. "He promised to help me, and I think he means it." Later that day, Amina left her house, her heart pounding as she made her way to the mansion. She had to see Ethan again, had to tell him what they needed to do next. She approached the iron gate cautiously, her eyes scanning the property for any sign of movement. She spotted Ethan near the garden, his head down as he spoke to one of the gardeners. Amina took a deep breath and stepped forward, her feet crunching softly on the gravel. Ethan looked up, his eyes widening when he saw her. He said something to the gardener before walking towards her, his expression serious. "Amina, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low. He glanced around nervously as if afraid of being caught. "I need to talk to you," Amina said, her voice steady. "It's important." Ethan nodded, motioning for her to follow him to a quieter part of the garden, away from prying eyes. He stopped near a large tree, turning to face her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Amina took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "I told my mother what you said," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "We need to do something, Ethan. We can't just let this go. We need them to acknowledge what they did." Ethan frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" he asked. What do you want me to do? Amina looked at him, her eyes pleading. You have to talk to your dad again, she said. You have to make him understand. Make him take responsibility. Ethan's face went pale, and he looked away, his jaw tight. Amina, I don't know if I can do that, he said, his voice strained. My dad, he's not the kind of person who admits when he's wrong. Amina stepped closer, her hands clenching into fists. Please, Ethan, she said, her voice cracking. This is about my father. It's about making sure his death wasn't for nothing. Ethan looked back at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. He was quiet for a long moment, and Amina could see the conflict in his expression. Finally, he nodded, letting out a long sigh. All right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll try. I don't know if it'll work, but I'll try. Amina felt a surge of hope, her heart pounding. She reached out, taking his hand in hers, her eyes locking on his. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Thank you so much. Ethan gave her a small smile, his eyes filled with something Amina couldn't quite place. Maybe pity, maybe respect. Just be careful, okay? He said, his voice low. If my dad finds out you've been here, it could get bad for both of us. Amina nodded, her heart pounding. She knew the risks, but she also knew she couldn't give up now. She had come too far. She squeezed Ethan's hand once before letting go, stepping back. I will, she promised. Just don't let him forget. Please. Ethan nodded, his eyes steady on hers. I won't, he said, his voice filled with determination. I'll talk to him tonight. Amina watched as Ethan turned and walked away, his shoulders tense. She knew he was scared, knew he was putting himself at risk by helping her. But she also knew that he was her only chance. She had to believe in him. That night, Amina sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the darkened street outside. She could hear her mother in the other room, her voice soft as she spoke to her brothers, telling them a bedtime story. Amina felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her father's death, the truth they had uncovered, the uncertainty of what was to come. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. She had to be strong, had to hold on to the hope that Ethan could make a difference. She thought of her father, of the way he used to smile at her, the way he worked so hard to give them a better life. She knew she couldn't bring him back, but she could fight for him, fight to make sure his death wasn't forgotten. The next day, Amina waited at the school gate, her eyes scanning the crowd for Ethan. She felt a mixture of hope and fear, her heart pounding as she searched for his familiar figure. Finally, she saw him, his expression serious as he made his way towards her. Ethan stopped in front of her, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept. He glanced around, then motioned for her to follow him to a quieter spot away from the other students. When they were alone, Ethan turned to face her, his jaw tight. I talked to my dad, he said, his voice low. I told him everything. About your father, about what I found out. Amina held her breath, her eyes locked on his. What did he say? She whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan looked away, his hands clenching at his sides. He wasn't happy, he said, his voice strained. He got really angry. He said it was none of my business, that I should leave it alone. Amina felt her heart sink, her body going numb. But, she began, her voice cracking. Ethan looked back at her, his eyes filled with determination. But I didn't stop, he said, his voice stronger. I told him he had to take responsibility. I told him that if he didn't, I would. Amina stared at him, her heart pounding. You did that? She whispered, her voice full of disbelief. Ethan nodded, his eyes steady on hers. Yeah, he said. I don't know what's going to happen. He didn't say much after that. But I think he's scared. I think he knows he can't keep this hidden forever. Amina felt tears welling up, her body trembling. She reached out, taking Ethan's hand in hers, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank you so much." Ethan gave her a small smile, his eyes softening. "I just hope it's enough," he said, his voice low. "I want to help, Amina, I really do." Amina nodded, her heart filled with a mix of hope and fear. She knew they weren't there yet, that there was still a long way to go, but they had taken a step, and that was enough for now. She squeezed Ethan's hand, her eyes locked on his. "We'll get there," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll make them see. We'll make them understand." Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with a new sense of purpose. "Yeah," he said, "we will." The next morning, Amina felt different. The heavy weight on her chest had lifted, even if just a little. Ethan had stood up to his father. He had done what she never could. He had faced someone powerful and made them hear the truth. She got dressed quickly, feeling a sense of urgency. Today, she needed to keep the momentum going. She entered the kitchen where her mother was making breakfast, her face still drawn from the stress of the past few days. Amina gave her a small, hopeful smile. "Ethan spoke to his dad, Mama," she said quietly, sitting at the table. "He told him what they did to Papa." Her mother paused, her hands resting on the counter. She turned to face Amina, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amina shook her head, her expression serious. "His father didn't say much, but Ethan thinks he's scared. I think it's working, Mama. I think they know they can't keep this hidden forever." Her mother's eyes filled with tears and she took a shaky breath. She crossed the small kitchen and sat beside Amina, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "You're so brave, Amina," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Your father would be so proud of you." Amina felt her chest tighten, tears welling in her eyes. She squeezed her mother's hands, nodding. "I'm doing this for him," she said, her voice cracking. "For all of us." That day at school, Amina felt a shift. For the first time, she didn't feel entirely powerless. She moved through the day with a quiet determination, her eyes searching for Ethan in the crowded hallways. When she finally saw him during lunch, sitting alone near the edge of the yard, she made her way over to him. Ethan looked up, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. He gave her a small smile, motioning for her to sit beside him. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Hey," Amina replied, sitting down. She glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "Did anything happen last night, after you talked to your dad?" Ethan let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "He was angry," he said, his voice low. "But I think he's scared. I think he knows that I'm serious about this. He doesn't want the attention." Amina nodded, her heart pounding. She could see the tension in Ethan's face, the worry that lingered in his eyes. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice firm. "We have to make them understand that they can't just forget about my father." Ethan looked at her, his eyes softening. "I'm not going to stop," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll keep pushing, I promise." Amina smiled, a sense of hope filling her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." That afternoon, as Amina walked home, she noticed a few of her classmates watching her, their eyes wide with curiosity. She could hear the whispers, the way they spoke her name in hushed tones. She didn't know what they were saying, but she didn't care. Let them talk. She was doing something important, something that mattered. When she reached her house, she was surprised to see Ethan standing outside, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the street nervously. He looked up when he saw her, his face relaxing slightly. Amina's heart skipped a beat and she quickened her steps. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice filled with surprise. Ethan glanced around, his expression serious. I needed to talk to you, he said, his voice low. My dad. He said something this morning. Amina felt her stomach twist, fear and hope battling inside her. What did he say? She asked, her voice trembling. Ethan took a deep breath, his jaw tightening. He said he's willing to talk. He wants to meet you and your mom, he said, his voice uncertain. He said he wants to make things right. Amina's eyes widened, her heart pounding. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. She looked at Ethan, her hands trembling. Are you serious? She whispered. Ethan nodded, his eyes steady on hers. Yeah, he said. He's scared of what might happen if this gets out. He wants to keep it quiet, but he's willing to help. Amina felt tears welling in her eyes, her body trembling with a mix of relief and fear. She had fought so hard for this moment, and now it was here. But it scared her. She nodded, taking a shaky breath. Okay, she said, her voice cracking. We'll do it. Ethan smiled, a look of relief crossing his face. I'll set it up, he said, his voice filled with determination. I'll make sure it happens. Amina nodded again, her heart filled with a sense of hope she hadn't felt in so long. She reached out, taking Ethan's hand in hers. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. For everything. Ethan squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with emotion. I'm with you, Amina, he said softly. We'll get through this. That evening, Amina sat with her mother in their small living room, her heart pounding as she explained what Ethan had told her. Her mother's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she listened. He wants to meet us? Her mother asked, her voice filled with both fear and hope. Why now? Amina took a deep breath, her eyes locking on her mother's. Because Ethan made him realize that he can't just hide it anymore. He knows we won't stay silent. Her mother nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. She took Amina's hands in hers, squeezing them tightly. Are you sure this is safe? She whispered. I don't want anything to happen to you. Amina nodded, her jaw tightening. We'll be careful, Mama, she said, her voice steady. But we have to do this. For Papa. Her mother looked at her for a long moment, then finally nodded, her eyes filled with determination. All right, she said, her voice cracking. We'll do it. The next day, Amina and her mother waited anxiously outside their small house. Amina could feel her heart pounding, her palms sweaty as they stood together, the sun beating down on them. Ethan had arranged for his father to come, and now they were waiting, the tension almost unbearable. Finally, a black car pulled up, and Amina's breath caught in her throat. She watched as Ethan stepped out first, his eyes locking on hers. He gave her a reassuring nod before opening the back door, and Amina's heart clenched as she saw Ethan's father step out. He was tall, his face stern, his eyes scanning the street with an air of discomfort. He walked towards them, his movements stiff, as if he didn't want to be there. Amina's mother stepped closer to her, her hand resting on Amina's shoulder, her grip tight. Ethan led his father over to them, his face tense. He gave Amina a small smile before turning to his father. Dad, this is Amina and her mother, he said, his voice steady. They're the family of the man who worked for us. Ethan's father looked at them, his face unreadable. He gave a short nod, his eyes flicking over them as if he was assessing them. Thank you for meeting me, he said, his voice low and clipped. Amina's mother stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. We appreciate you coming, she said. We just want answers. We just want the truth. Ethan's father nodded, his jaw tight. He glanced at Ethan, then back at Amina and her mother. I understand, he said, his voice stiff. I want to express my regret for what happened. I understand now that mistakes were made, and your family paid the price. Amina felt her chest tighten, her eyes filling with tears. She could hear the hesitation in his voice, the way he chose his words carefully. But it didn't matter. He was acknowledging it. He was admitting that they were at fault. Her mother took a shaky breath, her voice filled with emotion. "My husband worked for you for years," she said, her voice cracking. "He gave everything he had and you let him down." Ethan's father looked down, his face filled with discomfort. He nodded, his eyes avoiding theirs. "I know," he said quietly. "I can't change what happened, but I can offer compensation. I want to help you." Amina's mother nodded slowly, her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Amina, her face softening. "We just want to know that this won't happen again," she said. "We want to know that his death wasn't for nothing." Ethan's father looked at them, his face serious. He nodded. "I promise you, we will make changes. We will do better," he said, his voice filled with an edge of sincerity. "I am truly sorry for your loss." Amina felt her heart swell, her body trembling with a mix of grief and relief. It wasn't everything, but it was something. She looked at Ethan, his eyes locked on hers, and she gave him a small nod, her heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking, "for listening." Ethan's father nodded, his face softening slightly. "I hope this can bring you some peace," he said quietly. Amina nodded, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't justice, not entirely, but it was a step forward. And that was enough for now. The following morning was different. Amina woke up not feeling the same crushing weight that had been there for months. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, allowing herself a moment of stillness. The events of yesterday were still fresh in her mind. Ethan's father admitting fault, making promises, acknowledging the value of her father's life. It had been something Amina didn't think she would ever hear. She slowly got up, pulling on her clothes while her brothers played noisily in the corner of the room. Her mother was already awake, sitting by the window, her gaze distant as if she was deep in thought. Amina stepped up beside her, touching her mother's shoulder gently. "Good morning, Mama," she said quietly. Her mother looked up, her eyes a little puffy, but there was a softness there that Amina hadn't seen in a long time. She gave Amina a tired smile. "Good morning, my brave girl." Amina felt her chest tighten, the emotions threatening to spill over. She had fought so hard for this moment, for the acknowledgement that her father's death wasn't just another accident, something to be swept under the rug. She squeezed her mother's hand. "We're going to be okay, Mama." Her mother nodded, her eyes misty. She reached out, cupping Amina's face with her hand. "We will be, Amina. We will be." Later that morning, Amina walked to school, her steps lighter than they had been in months. She felt different, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She spotted Ethan standing near the school gate, his eyes scanning the crowd. When he saw her, his face brightened, and he gave her a small wave. Amina walked over to him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. "Hey," Ethan replied, his smile sincere. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "How are you feeling?" Amina took a deep breath, nodding. "I think I'm okay," she said, her voice filled with a sense of peace. "It's not everything, but it's a start." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "I know it wasn't easy," he said quietly. "But I think you did something important. I think your dad would be proud." Amina felt her throat tighten, her eyes filling with tears. She nodded, giving him a small smile. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Ethan's face softened, and he reached out, giving her hand a small squeeze. "You didn't need me, Amina. You were strong enough on your own. I just helped a little." Amina smiled, her heart filled with warmth. She knew that without Ethan, she would never have had the courage to face his father, to fight for the truth. He had been by her side when she needed him most, and she would never forget that. They stood together in silence for a moment, the world bustling around them. But for Amina, everything seemed to slow down. She knew there was still a long road ahead. The promise of compensation, of making changes, wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. But she wasn't afraid anymore. That afternoon, Amina walked home from school, her bag bouncing against her back. She passed the familiar streets, the dusty roads that wound through her neighborhood. She felt different. The world was still the same old houses, the same people, the same struggles. But something had shifted inside her. She felt stronger, more capable. As she approached her house, she saw her mother standing outside, talking to a neighbor. Her mother looked up, catching sight of Amina, and gave her a wave. Amina waved back, her heart swelling with warmth. She knew her mother was still worried, still uncertain of what the future would bring. But Amina felt hope, and she could see that her mother felt it too. She reached the front door, her brothers running out to greet her, their laughter filling the air. Amina knelt down, pulling them into a hug, their small arms wrapping around her tightly. "Amina," one of her brothers said, his voice full of excitement. "Can we play later? Can we go to the park?" Amina smiled, ruffling his hair. "Of course," she said, her voice soft. "We can do anything you want." She stood up, her brothers running back inside, their laughter echoing through the small house. Her mother walked over, her face softening as she looked at Amina. "They missed you," her mother said, her voice gentle. Amina nodded, her eyes misty. "I missed them too," she said. She reached out, taking her mother's hand in hers. "I think things are going to get better, Mama. Maybe not right away, but someday." Her mother nodded, her eyes locking on Amina's. "I believe that too," she said quietly. "And no matter what, we have each other." Amina smiled, her heart filled with warmth. They stood together, the sun setting in the distance, casting a soft golden glow over their small yard. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the ending Amina had once dreamed of. But it was enough. It was real, and it was theirs. The next morning, Amina woke up early, the sky still dark, the first hints of dawn just starting to touch the horizon. She dressed quickly, pulling on her worn sandals, and slipped out of the house quietly. She walked down the empty streets, the air cool against her skin, the world still and peaceful. She reached the park at the edge of the neighborhood, the same park she had hidden in so many times, feeling hopeless and afraid. She stood there now, her eyes scanning the quiet playground, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She thought of her father, his laugh, his kind eyes, the way he always made her feel safe. She knew she couldn't bring him back, that nothing would ever make up for losing him. But she also knew that she had done something for him, something that mattered. She had stood up, fought back, made her voice heard. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the rising sun, the golden light spilling over the horizon. She knew there would still be challenges, that her family would still struggle, that life would never be easy. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced her fears, faced those who thought they could silence her, and she had won, in her own small way. She turned and began to walk back home, her steps light, her heart filled with hope. The world was still the same, but she was different. She was stronger now, and she knew she could face whatever came next. And she knew she wasn't alone. She had her family, she had Ethan, and she had the memory of her father, guiding her, giving her strength. She was ready for whatever came next, ready to keep fighting, to keep hoping. As she approached her house, she saw her mother standing in the doorway, a smile on her face. Amina smiled back, her heart swelling with love and hope. They would be okay. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday they would be okay.